I just want to start by saying that I think everybody knows who I am. I teach composition here from '95. Composers, in retrospect, they look back and they find periods in their life. So I'm 70, so this is probably my final one. But since 16 months ago, I've been working more or less on a single project, which was a project for a marimbist named Fyodor Milkov, who has developed a new technique, which is called the keyboard technique for the marimba, where he manages to be able to play piano music on a 5-octave marimba without need for transcription. Of course, it has to be music that doesn't have more than 4 notes at any given time. If it's more than that, he will have to adapt. But he is able to play with a certain kind of angle on his technique, so he can actually create 2 different melodies with one hand and 2 other ones with the other. So you can actually do a great deal of counterpoint on the marimba in real time. And that is pretty much reinventing the instrument. The music that he actually particularly was interested in is the music of Domenico Scarlatti, because most of that music hardly ever has any more than 4 notes at any given time, and it's layered in all sorts of different directions that he can actually put the score, the piano score in front of him and just play it on the marimba. The main thrust of how I'm going to work this cycle into my presentation today is actually one thing that, particularly in the post-COVID era, from my own teaching experience, there is a certain kind of defeatism among young composers in the way they actually see the future and what brings in. And a lot of that has to do actually with AI. That becomes more and more capable. It's like a fast idiot still in many ways, but that's actually changing quite rapidly. I went to school when I was at university. My roommates were scientists, and AI was just like a theoretical concept at that time. And they would tell me that AI is a pipe dream, it's never going to happen. And in fact, some would say that 20 years ago, coming into the millennium. But it's getting invested so much and becomes part of the competitive process, and that's how it thrives. I'm going to have several threads running at the same time, but it's always with AI being the question and the answer somehow in my mind. About the same time that science left the Vatican and became some independent project with the Galilei family, Vincente Galilei being one of the first who actually used the equal temperament system to write in every key. Equal temperament itself is like a mystery because it was actually invented in China and in Europe a year apart with no communication between the East and the West. It was almost like a spontaneous revelation that happened, and there is no source actually saying that somehow it traveled. This kind of synchronicities that happen constantly in music and in science. For example, when you take the spiral of fifths, which is never-ending, and you will see that's not, as you go up the spiral, the D double flat, the C natural, and the B sharp are not exactly vertically aligned. Basically, the equal temperament was just squeeze this into a cycle where the sharps become the flats and then becomes a circle. Once you create a closed curvature like that, and then you start kind of using maybe unwarranted metaphors between space-time and the circle of fifths. If you look at the last thing there, the German sixth, which resolves semitonally in always the smallest possible steps of each one of its members, and ends up on the exact diametrically opposite side of the cycle of fifths, well, that's a wormhole. That's exactly what a wormhole does. Space-time is curved, so a straight line will get you much faster from one point of space-time to another. A contemporary of Einstein was credited with the concept but in fact, Beethoven invented it. Now, every time you close a system, it becomes a thermodynamic system which tends towards maximal entropy, because then it behaves according to the second law of thermodynamics. So, which means that the history of Western music is basically going from here to there, or to here, or jumping a little bit around. So you begin to leave the circumference, but always with small steps, or go larger cycles around the circumference. But in the end, of course, when you begin to do the augmented six chords, which happened very early, pretty much by Beethoven's time, he was using them all the time. At that point, you just kind of crisscross this space, which means that this system is having more and more entropy. And it was inevitable that at some point it's going to reach the state of maximal entropy, and then that will be the end of the thermodynamic system. And of course, that's what Schoenberg meant when he said it was up to happen and somebody had to do it. So that's a 12th tone. And then, of course, other systems were systematized, even though they were not as thermodynamic as this, like dynamics, rhythms, and so forth. And then you reach the point where Pierre Boulez created a system where everything was serialized. He would call it the totally structured system, but it was in fact the ultimate entropical system. If you toss a coin once, and you judge from the results, it has 100% probability of being one of the two sides and 0% probability of being the other. You toss it 100 times, and then it's probably 50-50, the probability. So the more you toss it, the more total serial it becomes. Right? So in some ways, the Cage's book of changes and Boulez's structure number 2 are exactly the same principle looked from two completely different ways. But the result is exactly the same. It's total randomness. This is really interesting. According to a textbook on human physiology, the human sensory system sends the brain about 11 million bits of information each second. Your conscious mind cannot process anywhere near that amount. The actual amount of information we can handle has been estimated to be somewhere between 16 and 50 bits of information per second. The analytical mind runs about that fast. There is another layer that's disputed by quantum scientists who have actually proven experimentally the quantum superposition and quantum decoherence. The quantum decoherence is when you observe the superimposed quantum state and it breaks down to a single classical event, this is classical reality. That happens at the speed of an attosecond. An attosecond is an interesting number. It is the fastest time that we have been able to determine. I think the most important thing to put it in perspective for non-scientists is that an attosecond is to a second what a second is to about 31.7 billion years. So a second to an attosecond, the second translated in connection to an attosecond as a 31.7 billion years means that a second of time, the way we know it, is the equivalent of 3 times the history of the universe. You may wonder what all this has to do with music, but I'm going to get there. Quantum decoherence is this. In other words, at the speed of an attosecond, it is what classical reality is, and it decoheres at the speed that we just said in the previous slide. The reason I'm going into all of that is not just because I actually know what I'm talking about. I'm trying to learn what I'm talking about, but because if our brain actually works at the rate of an attosecond, it is able to create what this is, we don't have to worry about AI, because it's not going to get there for at least a few billion years. So the fastest computer that exists in this world is ours. So the point is, what do we do with it? In other words, do we actually create an analytical technique, which will just be going between 15 to 65 bits per second? We're going to go with the fastest kind of rate, which is mostly with the denser structure of the right hemisphere of the brain, which has many more neurons that are much more densely correlated to one another. So That would be the 11 million bits of information per second. We're probably approaching music the wrong way, because we're just choosing the slow mode because we have absolute control over it. But it doesn't mean that the faster mode we don't have control. In other words, it does not run independently of us. It runs in us. So one of the things that I believe is when you process that mode, that mode is the neural structure of the right hemisphere, which is completely different chemically and in terms of neural connections than the left hemisphere of the brain. That much we know. The actual decision-making of the brain just goes back and forth all the time over the corpus callosum. So that's why sometimes the brain is firing on the hand before we actually are conscious of having made a decision to move the hand out. 11 million bits of information per second is kind of a frightening number in itself. So we're not going to talk about science fiction now with Matrix and all of that, which is hotly contested from both sides of the scientific community. The other one is not. Because it's so fast a protocol, we do not actually connect to that level of speed with conscious understanding of what is happening, but with emotional understanding. Emotional understanding is a very extremely faster bandwidth of knowing, except that we cannot actually use the one-to-one correspondence because that is so slow that you're not really taking advantage of that speed. So, if you go into a concert, who do you think is more likely to process music at the speed of 11 million bits of information per second? The persons in the audience who don't know music, or the persons in the audience who know music, or the musicians on the stage? Well, the answer, at least if the experiments are correct, is people in the audience who don't know music, because they do not go through the logical pathways to understand what is happening, which would slow them down to the lower speed of this processing. If you get goosebumps basically means that all of a sudden you have this kind of experience that you do not know how to deconstruct, and you don't really care to deconstruct when you have it. Can you imagine somebody falling in love with somebody and then say, okay, I better go now to the library and find out what falling in love really means? You know, right? You know in a different way. Music is exactly the same way. I remember when I had some pieces performed by great musicians, which have been played a lot of times, like my old photographs by the Griffin Trio. After I hear it so much, it has become now somebody else's piece. I'm not able to get the thrill anymore of it, because at that point, I processed it in every possible format, and now it has become objectified from me. And so have the musicians, by the way. So the Griffin Trio have actually never played it twice the same way. They do rubatos here, they do accelerando somewhere else, they reinvent it every time, otherwise they would just not be able to play it anymore. And that refreshes it constantly, but the core thing, the one that's actually on the page, doesn't change. So if you're thinking about it in those terms, you're always hearing the same thing. If you're listening to the Griffin Trio interpreting it, you're hearing a different thing every time. Great musicians will do that because they almost must for their own sanity if they play classical repertoire. Nested realities as fractals. This is a fractal that I did in 1980. It is the overtone series. It's a string. You take a string and you put the two ends together on the top, and then this would be the Pythagorean intervals and also the Pythagorean shapes. The tonic will be up there. This will be the first overtone with two notes, one in the middle of the string. This will be the third harmonic. This will be the fourth harmonic, fifth, sixth, and so forth. Each one of those harmonic systems connect all the diagonals. And then you get this thing, which is all straight lines. There's not one single curve in this design. This relationship between curve and straight is pi, the diameter and the periphery of the circle. They don't meet. They meet at infinity. Every infinity number, a nonlinear number, is responsible for all the beauty we see in the world, that we understand as beauty. The golden ratio is the relationship between two Fibonacci numbers. One of them has to be infinity, and the other one is the Fibonacci number before infinity. Calculate that. I believe that the universe and human knowledge are inhabited by a constantly and exponentially greater number of things. Stars in the universe, apps for our computers, words in our language. Patterns do not proliferate with equal abundance or at all. There appears to be a finite number of patterns in the universe, even though we keep on discovering more of them through deeper inquiry and recognition. We recognize things through the patterns reflected on them, and we describe the relationship between the two through metaphors. Powerful metaphors are often invisible and inaudible, but allow us to understand something deeper in our experience of externality that is not directly spelled out. Such instance is the sonata form of the classical masters, a metaphor for human-gender relationships in late 18th, early 19th century Vienna, reflected in modes and key relationships among motivic thematic protagonists. Do you know what I mean by that? Does anybody know? How many of you know symphonies or sonata forms of any kind where the second theme is in the minor key? Very, very rare. Most of the time, even if the first theme is major, the second theme stays major. That's usually the depiction of most sonata forms. Minor is basically the theme, what we call sadness, introspection, suffering. In other words, depth of experience, which is reserved for the masculine description as opposed to the feminine, which is always supposed to be pretty and happy. So, what happens between exposition, development, and recapitulation? The two people meet at somebody's house. They begin to date in the development, and then in the recapitulation, exactly in the key of the masculine theme, which is the tonic key in the sense that the masculine theme happens first. So the girl always leaves her house and goes to the husband's. Did anybody in Vienna at that time could describe it so? No, but metaphors are not descriptions. Metaphors are the thing that lies invisible between things. But the sonata form actually made sense for no apparent reason because everybody used it. There was an undercurrent which actually was confirming something about the norms and societal things of the time that somehow made the sonata form to make sense. A lot of people will say, well, the second theme plays on the key of the first theme because you got to end the tonic. But there's no problem about having the second theme first and then the first theme second, and then you ended the tonic anyway. Or have the first theme like a repetition of the exposition, and then have a coda at the end, which actually ends up in the key of the first theme. I mean, all of those things are possibilities, right? But they were not practiced that way. Metaphor in contemporary composition is a tool for communicating directly with a listener who has no prior knowledge of constructed musical semantics. It has, therefore, an advantage over educated listeners. This is what I said before. Metaphor is such a complex and rich semiotic with no quantifiable correspondence between reflecting and reflected that AI will not be able to fathom at this level of complexity. It is not currently programmed and highly unlikely that it will ever be in the future to detect such structures. Like past and present day rationalists, it will remain blind and deaf to powerful agency of metaphor. I could explain more of that, but I think we need to move on. Okay, so metacomposition. Here I am. I hate terms, and I'm using one. So, and please don't come to me in the future and say, now I'm doing metacomposition. We have already post and meta and all of that stuff. We discussed it in the previous composer forum. Cliché. How many of you would like to write clichés in your music? Nobody. That's kind of the worst thing that somebody can tell you about your creativity. But cliché is a packet of a lot of information that is bundled together, a set of patterns that contains overexposed information that carries no surprise or invites attention from the responder. In music, language, and art, we use terms like boring, derivative, unoriginal, brain-numbing, etc. as English substitutes for cliché. Musical information is a perilous path composers and performers walk in communicating musical information. They walk on a razor-thin path with two deadly precipices on each side. On one side, they may fall at any time into the precipice of redundancy, the landlord of cliché. On the other side, they may fall into the indecipherable complexity, which is another name for information noise. When listeners label something as noise, they stop listening informationally, that is, even though they may resonate with it in psychic or doctrinal ways and find it interesting and moving in a generic manner that is independent of the specific linear release of information by the music itself. Now, suppose that you create music which, on the account of its familiarity, would tend to fall off into the metaphorical razor's edge on the premises of redundancy. Also suppose that instead of using cliché in real time, you bundle cliché gestures together and bundle them into tiny time packets in rapid sequence so that the listeners are constantly racing against the clock to unpack the individual information and call them for what they are. They will recognize that it is something they know, but their linear analytical mechanism would be too slow to unpack everything in real time. So, at some point, they will realize that they will have to abandon linear hearing and trust a deeper and faster perceptual and evaluative mechanisms so that they can catch up with a collective meaning that transcends the individual cliches. Such an informational process would be a post-meta, Uber, call it whatever you want, communication portal that only contemporary minds used to information overloads can process and call it truly contemporary. In this packing manner, clichés can be transformed into viable communication. Okay, so it's not what they are, it's how they're used. I will start with the second cycle of my quantum superpositions, which are based on Scarlatti sonatas. This one is on K24. Scarlatti wrote 550 sonatas, so this is very much a youthful piece. This particular piece has all sorts of ideas which today we pretty much would consider cliché. He finishes something and he considers it finished, and then he moves into another idea, into another idea, into another idea, and it's just sabotaging all of these ideas, what would have been really interesting if they had a little bit more development, which is usually what happens when you're enthusiastic about your music and you think you got it, it's all there, but it is there to you, but it's not necessarily there to anybody else. So before I got into this sequence, I felt challenged. This thing did not work for me, and that's exactly what I'm going to use and see how I can make it work. So I needed to throw something which is just almost like it pushes you off balance, and non sequitur has absolutely no reason for being there, to just kind of almost throw the listener completely out of balance of how they follow the music, and then just go with the sequence there and say, how much of that now I can actually buy because they're still recovering from the shock. So that was it. But then the only thing I don't do when I actually compose music is think, because I'm not going to discover anything that way. I'm just probably going to be going back to knowledge that already exists. I want to have conversation with Scarlatti, and I want to have a conversation with the listener, and that's about it. And that conversation has to be in a way that's not mediated by other assumptions, because I'm not sure what assumptions the listener is going to have. I take naps at 70, I allow myself. So I wake up and then all of a sudden this Kakanimi idea came to me. So I had to go backwards in my composition up until that point and change this thing, which happens all the time, and change it to this. Sharpen the second note, and then it becomes a completely different mode. It could be Arabic modes that you can find that, but you can also find it in blues. Those three notes remind you of anything? Don't look at the screen. I'm going to play this thing a couple of times. Just listen, but don't look. One more time. Okay, don't look still. Okay, I could play that a few more times, but I think I made my point already. Did anybody hear 7/8 bar in there? Now, I'll play it one more time, and now you watch the score. That's why I don't deal with notation when I compose. It took me a few sleepless nights to figure out what's happening here. First of all, right here, you have an accelerando, right? You have triplets here and triplets there, right? Here you have 4 eighth notes, but those eighth notes are in an accelerando faster than eighth notes and slightly slower than the triplets up there. This note, the E sharp, is changing the direction, so basically you're hearing these notes as a triplet, you're hearing these 4 notes as 4 eighth notes, and this one, by fluke, it just actually happens to sound like the downbeat of this bar. This was not how I did it. I actually put here the 4/4 bar of the Scarlatti, and it sounded to me like it was a 9/8 bar. And I just said, what the hell is going on? I mean, I tried so many times, it still sounded like a 9/8 bar. And then at some insane moment, I said, okay, so it's 9/8 bar, let me just chop the first eighth note and see what happens. Then it sounded like a 4/4 bar. This was not premeditated by any way. I was just trying to solve a problem that drove me crazy for a while. All I'm saying is that the minute you create with notation, you're actually creating music which describes the notation. But cognition is a far more complex phenomenon than that. If you can actually compose staying at the level of cognition, then you can start creating things which are actually quite remarkable. You pull the rabbit out of the hat, but you have to actually convince everybody in the hall to just look somewhere else when it happens. It just happened by fluke, but it is interesting. I'll play you now the next example, where I actually brought this back at the very end, because it would be absolutely ridiculous to have it like that and not revisit it and make another statement about it. So at the very end, before the coda, it happens again. But this time, there is no accelerando. The accelerando of the previous example, the 2 tempi were actually in a 3-2 metric modulation, but it was the accelerando which was navigating the 2 tempi. So when you reached the 7/8 bar, the new tempo was creating triplet sensations. So this one is the 4/4 bar that I had to chop off the previous time, because this time it would sound like a 7/8, so I did not want that. So now I'm going to play an example for 3 marimbas, Quantum Entanglements, which will premiere next August in a big festival in Germany. Theodor Melkov in the middle is the one who commissioned all of this cycle. Anders is from Denmark, and Arjan from the Netherlands. This is for 3 marimbas. And every time you have 3 of anything is an interesting metaphor for power politics. We are in a 3-power politic with 3 superpowers, trying to second guess how the 2 will eliminate one of the 3, with changing alliances all the time. It happened in Roman history. It was triumvirates that ended up in dictatorships with bloody wars between them. Okay, so these are all observations I'm making now, which is after the fact. And it has to do with understanding how profoundly deep power politics are, particularly in the presence of three players. Here, Marimba 3 and Marimba 2 play exactly the same thing, except that the one plays it in triplets and ends later, and this one plays it in 16th notes and ends faster. So these quarter notes here are those extended quarter notes over there. Now, this part is pianissimo and this one is piano. And this dynamic difference is actually helping this cognitive process. So this one is the active part. Up until this point, you're actually hearing Marimba 3 mainly, right? It's when Marimba 3 stops there that you're actually not only hearing Marimba 2, you realize now is a slowed down version of the part you just heard, but you only know that because you are now going from this point on and retrocognizing what you heard and what you had not consciously registered. In other words, at this point, you're hearing the whole thing, even though you did not even know that it was there when you were actually hearing it, because this one draws all your conscious attention. I'll just play the beginning only, just to see how that works. I've heard this a gazillion times, and I'm still not paying attention to this at all, until the other one stops, and then I actually know that this thing has been playing. In other words, it's bundled at a deep layer of cognition, and then it's brought to the foreground when you actually understand what this is. In any situation, you will never hear this bar as a 7/8. It has no 7/8-ness whatsoever in it. It is like a detente that allows the slower player to finish the same material that you already heard finished here. Now, this is really interesting. Starting here, Marimba 3 is playing faster, so the fastest thing is basically the attention grabber. So you're listening to this as being more aggressive and faster, and it grabs your attention, and then it rests because this one has to finish the same thing at a slower pace. So if this is a contest between two contesting parties, the third party, which one would it choose to align with? The second one, right? Yeah. Because the second one is the one which is less threatening. In other words, it's the one that needs time to do its thing. The other one goes aggressively in and then rests. So it follows with triplets. The third time, obviously this person feels now that it is left out of the loop because this one is still kind of aggressive, so it doubles up. So now it's still in triplets, but it is now finishing faster than this. So now that becomes a threatening party. What does the top one do? 16th notes. So I firmly believe that you hear those things, particularly when you do not go analytically into the music. In other words, these are metaphors that you can draw them from current political life or the Roman Empire. Metaphors are independent of the things that connect them. Metaphors are real. The things come and go. The politics of three is very real. All the players who played power politics come and go. I'm going to play two movements. These ones are from sonatas which are very beautifully done in the original. The thing that fascinates me is when you stand outside of your time and you just kind of look at the world as without time. And the only person in music history that I know to have done that is Beethoven, late Beethoven, who does not belong into the historical sequence of anything that actually happened before or after him. I'm still trying to understand what he was thinking when he was writing the Grossi Fugue, which on the face of it is not supposed to work at all, but it's a masterpiece. Or the Sonata 111, which is pretty much a theme and variations in basic tonalities with none of his fancy modulations or pretty much anything like that. But it's a masterpiece. This is not a masterpiece, but I'm registering basically how I understand not the music of Beethoven, but in this particular case, I'm in a void and I'm together with Scarlatti, and the only one I have a conversation is Beethoven. one more. That one was the first one of the cycle for two pianos, and this one will be the last one. This one is the most personal because at that time I was actually misdiagnosed with a dreaded thing that would have happened to my health, and it turned out, in retrospect, to have been not that, but I wrote that piece during the time I actually thought that was the case. And it is the closing piece of the entire 2 hours of works. So I'm going to play it, and then we'll leave some time for your questions. Yeah, but there were just like techniques, and here, what happened in that movement is when it goes up semitonally, the whole thing overlaps and goes up semitonally. It slows down in tempo, and it adds dynamics, energy. In other words, I'm treating all the musical parameters as if they're thermodynamics. You're climbing a mountain, you start with a certain kind of speed and you reduce it as you go up because you're tired, but you have to invest more energy in order to continue up. Then when you go to the top and you're just kind of descending again, it's exactly the opposite. So the flute concerto didn't have any of that, but here is like investment of effort to some kind of result. And then again, I did not know why I was doing that when I was doing it, but I'm realizing now that it is consistent with that kind of climbing and descending, where all the different musical parameters are not independent things. Here, they're all part of one concerted effort to climb up and go down, and the metaphor of that. First of all, you talk about metaphor as if it's a thing that can actually be defined. I don't use it at all that way. I mentioned the thermodynamic thing, but I mention it because you're musicians. I would not say to a listener, so you will hear this like climbing a mountain going down. You may hear it as something entirely different, and that's fine. Let me just put it in a different way. We are all trained to be musicians, become professional musicians in the future, right? So at least you're all in your 20s or 30 or somewhere in there. So you have another 70 years, probably, or more, but who knows what happens by that time. In your time right now, high school problems in music disappear. Universities are dropping their music departments. It's going to be like entropy again. So, who will actually be your listeners? The ones you're going to explain your process. Why do they care? What is it? Like, what's going to be the mode of communication that you're going to establish? If we actually communicate with presumptions, we are dead meat for AI because it will do it better. It will know exactly, it will have statistic analysis of everybody who walks into your concert, and their piece that's going to be played after yours or before yours, it will have accounted for all of that stuff. Now, should you be a pop composer and just kind of do the same thing? Those statistics that pop music does, they don't work. The pop music that has survived is very, very intuitive and has insights into the listener's psyche that evades us academics because it's not something that can be contextualized and analyzed afterwards. That's what we do. We analyze, which means we slow down. So, metaphor for me is that glue that the minute you try to touch it, it disappears. The deeper the protocols are that we actually call metaphors. At the speed that we say that the brain actually works at its deepest, you have gazillion different things, patterns, structures, all of those things that already exist inside your mind. You don't have direct access to them because the direct access means you're going to lose yourself in the jungle. But if you try to find your way, now we say, oh, I've seen this tree before, I'm just going to follow this thing, you're going to get lost even deeper. That's the surest way to be lost in the jungle. But if you, first of all, you don't get overwhelmed by fear because that's paralyzing, but you're just kind of stop thinking so that a lot of deeper things become into your mind. You may find your way out of the jungle without actually thinking of how you got there. Most of the most amazing things that happen in your life, either bad or good, you're trying to find how did you get there before and you just can't tell. It's never an accident. I mean, there are no accidents in the universe. There's just a lot of deep patterns that we don't access. Then when something happens, we think it's an accident. Okay. Machines can only process what you know. they don't form independent knowledge. I don't think that's actually possible. Machines, in order to run at the rate of your brain runs at a speed where 1 second is equivalent to the life of the universe. You're like a deep mine, but you only tap the surface. Then you don't find gold, you say, screw this. So you walk away. That doesn't mean that the mine further down doesn't have, it's a diamond mine. It's just that you don't actually have any reason or evidence to think of that, and then you don't look. It's not looking, it's sensing. I think it's a different kind of knowing that actually happens at that level. You understand, but you don't have any path to your understanding. You have to prepare yourself. I mean, that's what meditation is, where you clear your mind. You do not process your mind. If you process your mind, you're just going slowly into nowhere. So now, how do you teach that at the university in composition? Metaphors. Because you don't tell the young composer what to do. You just throw something out there. I have so many students. I say something like that, and they go, got it. I never ask, what did you get? I look at their face, and then I know whether they got it or not. Most of the time when they say that, they actually got it. We're not going to write a theory book. I wrote one, which is about the cognitive understanding of music, which is on my website, with all of these examples that I actually played and many more. It's a lifetime journey where I was the oddball. And academia for me was the wrong way of learning things. After almost 30 years, I'm not convinced that I disagree with my original concept. You're learning a lot of things, but you're not really learning your own capacity. Nobody is going to teach you that. You have to be able to trust that you can actually go there. But we're not allowed inside that place, because if we have not mastered many things, we can become dangerous to humanity. The most stupid of us can become dangerous to the whole of humanity. You see these patterns throughout history. If you defocus and you only see the psychic connections, you will see them just happening. This kind of metaphors reappear all the time. A long answer, but that's me. Yeah. Thank you.